Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Yann Lemerdi. I'm the Deputy Cultural Attaché at Villa Albertine, the cultural services of the French Embassy in the US. I am delighted to welcome you tonight for this new episode of Museum Talks, our series dedicated to French art in American museums. This episode is live streamed from the Philadelphia Museum of Art galleries and moderated online. As usual, it will be recorded and available for replay on the French Embassy's YouTube channel. So tonight we are honored to host co-curators Jennifer Thompson and Laurel Garber for a talk on Mary Cassatt at Work exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in conversation with our great moderator, Faya Causey. Faya is a lecturer, scholar, and educator with interests ranging from the Paleolithic to the present. She earned her PhD from UC Santa Barbara and began her career as a professor of art history in California. She recently retired as head of academic programs at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC. And although her primary field is ancient art and her best-known work are on amber, her first publications were on the Impressionists Pissarro and Caillebotte. Her most recent work is on Michelangelo and recently on Paul Cézanne. She was elected as Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London and a member of Société Paul Cézanne. Jennifer, Laurel, and Faya, thank you very much for being with us today. The floor is yours for what promises to be a wonderful museum talks.
Thank you, Jan, and thank all of you for joining us this evening. And we have a record number. We are traveling to Philadelphia to one of the premier art museums in the United States and the world. Over 200 galleries and more to see on the grounds and in the neighborhood. We're going to go now into the wonderful exhibition, Mary Cassatt at Work. And just a note, if you haven't been, the show will be on through September 8th, and the museum is open Thursday through Monday, 10 to 5, except on Friday when they're open till 8:45. Don't miss it. This evening, we will be taken through the exhibition by the two co-curators, the museum's curators responsible for this innovative show. They will take us through the exhibition. It will be about 30 minutes or so. At about 6:45, we will take questions from the audience until about 7 o'clock. So if you have a question, write it in the Q&A. And if you see a question that you really like, you can upvote it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the curators behind the exhibition, Jennifer Thompson and Laurel Garber. And they're going to walk us through, which is wonderful, is that we have a camera on a gimbal, and so you will feel like you are there, hopefully. Jennifer Thompson is head of the European Art Department at the Philadelphia Art Museum, Museum of Art, and curator of the Rodin Museum. Her full title is the Gloria and Jack Drosdick Curator of European Painting and Sculpture, and curator of the John G. Johnson Collection, Philadelphia Museum of Art. Jennifer earned her MA and PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Since she joined the museum in 2000, Jennifer has published widely and curated many notable exhibitions, including the focus of our talk today. Her previous shows, and I just chose some, include The Impressionist Eye, that was in 2019, Old Masters Now, celebrating the Johnson Collection, which was in 2017, Discovering the Impressionist Paul Douin-Rouel and New Painting of 2015, emphasizing that role between dealer and artist. A personal a favorite of mine was in 2012, Van Gogh Up Close. And now to Laurel. Laurel Garber is the Park Family Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. A specialist in 19th century French graphic art, she earned a PhD from Northwestern University and her MA from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. Among Laurel's other projects at the PMA, one is Emma Amos Color Odyssey, that was in 2021, and Coming up in 2025, not to be missed, is Wanda Gag, Art for Life's Sake. Prior to Laurel joining the department in Philadelphia, she held curatorial fellowships and positions at the J. Paul Getty Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Clark Art Institute. And now over to you, Jennifer and Laurel.
Good evening and welcome to Mary Cassatt at Work. I'm Jenny Thompson, one of the curators of the exhibition.
And I'm Laurel Garber. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
We've spent the last 4 years thinking hard about Mary Cassatt, thinking about her artistic practice, reading her words, and paying close attention to the subject matter of her pastels, paintings, and prints. We're in the midst of a very large exhibition of almost 130 of her works. So what Laurel and I have done this evening is to pick about a dozen highlights of the exhibition, some of our favorite works that will help bring out some of the themes in the exhibition and provide a kind of some close looking. So let's move to the first object, one of the earliest paintings in the exhibition as you walk through the space. This is a painting from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art called The Child's Bath. It's a subject that we often associate with Cassatt, of a woman and a child. And as we look closely at this painting, we of course see the child who's slipping off of the woman's lap. This, however, is a child who looks kind of hot. They look maybe grumpy, sleepy, perhaps a little cranky as well. So we have a real sense of what the child is experiencing in this moment and the child is going through. We have less a sense of the woman. Her face is hidden from us. It's very focused on the child. The one detail of the hand that I find so, the woman that I find so compelling is her hand. She has a reddened hand that is dipped into a blue and white bowl of water. And that hand is one of the calmer portions of painting on the surface of this canvas. The rest of the canvas is filled with a fairly agitated, very lively brushstroke. And that hand is particularly grounding in the sense of suggesting what's about to happen here, is that the woman is soothing the child so that she can give it a bath before it takes a nap. And Cassatt's attention to this very specific moment and what the child and the woman are experiencing seems to ground the painting in a moment in time, and what could in fact be a fleeting moment in time as well. And I think that if we think about it within the broader context of Impressionism and what Cassatt's peers like Monet were doing when they were capturing a sunset or capturing a specific time of day or the weather as it was unfolding under a landscape, we can see Cassatt actually bringing some of those Impressionist ideas into a domestic sphere and thinking about what would Impressionism look like if you were to bring it to this subject of a woman who is sort of caring for a child, looking after it, preparing to bathe it. And these are some of the ways I think in which Cassatt sort of embarks and embraces the idea of Impressionism and makes it her own in a very distinctive way, with her choice of subject matter, but also with her handling of different materials. And that's probably a good segue, Laurel, to talk about one of the first pastels.
If you'll follow me this way, one of the large emphases of this exhibition and one of the things that's really key to understanding Cassatt's innovations is that she was a very skillful painter, but she was also an incredibly prolific artist in pastel and in printmaking. And in this example, this is one of the pastels that she debuts in the Impressionist exhibition in 1879. And throughout her career, Cassatt actually produced more pastels than any other media. She created 380 pastels throughout her career, 320 paintings, and over 200 printed subjects. And this is one of the earliest examples of a pastel on canvas here, that she's really making a statement about her first big participation in the Impressionist exhibition in 1879. And here she's really working pastel in all sorts of ways, really trying to discover what it can do and how it can really allow her to depict the spectacle of the theater and the modern woman who's observing it. So we see that she's used the powderiness of pastel to render this subject's face, which is partly obscured by the fan. She's using pastel to describe the kind of sweeping architecture and gilding of this opera house. She's probably using it here to render velvet. And we know that Cassatt crushed up her pastels. She applied them wet. She mixed them with other materials. And we know that because when we began working on this exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Jenny and I worked really closely with our amazing colleagues in conservation to launch a full-scale study of Cassatt's materials and techniques within our own holdings of her works in the collection. So we're very lucky to have 84 works by Cassatt here, and we used those holdings to do a systematic study of her working materials. And this kind of in-depth systematic study had never been performed before. And we were really lucky to draw on the insights that we learned from that collaborative study. So just to point out one thing, we learned, for example, that Cassatt really delights in the ability to kind of work and rework her materials and her compositions until she's satisfied with them. So just to point out one change she makes that I think should be visible even to you through the screen here is that you can see that she alters the opening of the fan, first opening up to here, then changing it to here, and then ultimately settling on the fan's placement here, probably to give more depth into the incredible space and architecture of this scene. And these kinds of changes, as we'll show you as we move through the show, Cassatt actually likes to incorporate and sort of build into her compositions. And I'll just say one more thing. Unlike many of her peers, Cassatt had no studio photographs taken. She left no kind of record of her procedures in photographic form. So we really have to rely on the works that she leaves us, but also on the amazing sense of her work that she gives in her letters. So Jenny's going to talk a bit more about that.
So a good chunk of our early research days were spent reading Cassatt's letters, and the letters take on a particularly important place for someone like Cassatt, who was born in Pennsylvania, trained in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, but lived the bulk of her life overseas. And so letters being exchanged between her family in Paris and her family in Philadelphia were critical ways for the family to stay connected. But throughout the letters, we find a continual refrain about, Mary's at her studio, or I'm working hard 8 to 10 hours a day. She talks about the challenges of her practice and having a model come into her studio every day. And through reading the letters, we found that Cassatt was continually emphasizing the fact that she was a working artist. And this is critical because she wants to be seen as a professional. It's a moment in which women often did take up art making as an amateur practice, but Cassatt from age 16 was committed to becoming a professional artist. And the letters, some of which are featured in the exhibition, others of which we have quotes from Cassatt's letters high on the walls of the exhibition, help us to kind of understand how she frames herself in her own words. But as Laurel mentioned, it of course is her artwork, which tells us so much about her aims, about the way that she's navigating through in her own artistic practice through the art market, and in fact, navigating the Impressionist world. She joins the Impressionists in 1879. This is a work done just a year before in 1878. This is a work that she paints and then gets sent to the US for exhibition. It's called At the Theater. It's work at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And here we see Cassatt taking up the subject again of a woman in a theater. It's something that her Impressionist peers were investigating at the same time. One of the things that we see here is a woman holding very firmly opera glasses in her hand. They're not an accessory, they're a tool for helping her see the stage, which of course is sort of off the canvas. But we get a real sense of her fixation and the way that this woman is very attentive to what's happening in the performance in several below her. But of course, one of the interesting things that Cassatt does with this canvas is that she mirrors this woman who's dressed in black, a very fashionable color at the time. We just see a little bit of white hint coming out at her neck and at her cuffs. She's using opera glasses to look at the stage, but across the loge from her, we see a man also dressed in black with white at his neck and at his cuffs, who has his opera glasses trained on her. And of course, this is something that happened often at the theater. Members of the audience would look at one another as much as they would look at the stage. But Cassatt, of course, shows us this woman particularly focused on the performance. And that, I think, is her way of entering into the Impressionist conversation about theater subjects. In the exhibition, we're particularly fortunate to be able to show the oil painting next to a graphite drawing on a small piece of paper. It measures about 3 inches by 5 inches. And this is a rare opportunity to see Cassatt's drawings, maybe made at the theater, because it's on such a small piece of paper that she might have had a sketchbook tucked in her pocket when she attended the theater. But what we find in Cassatt's work is that she very rarely makes makes preparatory sketches. She doesn't engage in meticulous planning. I think that comes out really nicely in our next group of objects, which are pastels that Cassatt works on. And as Laurel had mentioned earlier, as she develops in her confidence, she often leaves traces of her work visible on the surfaces of her paintings or her pastels. So she relies less on preparatory studies, and she seems kind of almost impatient and eager to get to work on her full-size paper or canvases.
Yeah, so here, I'll just point out 2 pastels here. So unlike the woman in the loge, who's obviously in a somewhat of a public space of the theater, we were really interested in Cassatt's preoccupation with showing women in private spaces or in domestic spaces. And then also in women who sort of seem to be somewhat in between public and private space. So here we have a woman who's clearly seated on a kind of upholstered armchair, but her exact surroundings are not clearly rendered, and she's dressed for outside. And so there's a kind of tension, I think, here between coming and going, between being dressed for the outside world, but still being firmly planted in the inside world. And Cassatt, I think, makes that kind of tension really visible in her extremely active hand. And with pastel, and I'm just going to bring us over to this pastel here, it's as if we're watching Cassatt's hand in motion, because she leaves traces of the pastel stick really visible against blank expanses of paper. And so throughout this exhibition and Cassatt's body of work, she often leaves the kind of question of whether a work is completely finished kind of open-ended. It's almost beside the point. And in some ways, we're able to better see in making the kind of changes that Cassatt makes here in this scene of a woman arranging her veil and kind of preparing to go outside, we really see Cassatt's own hand in motion. And there's a kind of wonderful play between the way Cassatt herself makes herself an artist and the women that she depicts kind of readying themselves for the world. And you'll see as we move here, and I think as you've already glimpsed, that throughout the exhibition, we've really worked hard to integrate her paintings, pastels, and printmaking. We know that Cassatt worked really fluidly in these materials, often actually exploring the same subject within all 3 media, kind of exploring what each material could do, what it could lend to a particular subject. However, in this gallery, we wanted to focus on her color printmaking because it was such an extraordinary moment in the history of 19th century printmaking and a real high watermark in her career as well. So I'm going to be showing you a series of 10 color prints that Cassatt makes in 1890 to 1891. And she embarks on this series of works after she attends almost obsessively this exhibition of Japanese color woodblock prints that's on view in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts in 1889. And we know from Cassatt's letters that she attends the exhibition again and again. She writes to her friend and co-impressionist Berthe Morisot that insisting that she also attend the exhibition. And Cassatt says something like she can only dream of color on copper. Cassatt is really inspired by the dynamic colors, the patterns, and the techniques that she observes in the Japanese woodblock prints. She doesn't attempt woodblock printing herself, but rather adapts what she's inspired by to the etching techniques and printmaking materials that she's already familiar with. We know she acquires a printing press of her own and works with color basically for the first time in her printmaking process, and conceives of a series of 10 subjects of small moments from daily life, all depicting women, sometimes women and children, here preparing for a bath, washing one's face, here, preparing one's hair, sort of small glimpses of daily life. And she's throughout this series, combining print techniques in totally new ways. She's overlapping print plates. It's an extraordinary orchestration of labor that she really pioneers with the help of a professional printer whom she actually credits underneath the image in a kind of acknowledgement of their collaboration together. And I'm just going to share one favorite from the exhibition, which is this print here, where we see a woman seated at a desk, sealing a letter. There's this ravishing combination of patterns and floral techniques, all really by hand applied inking. And we really closely studied this print at the PMA and worked closely with our paper conservator, Christina Taylor, to really understand Cassatt's techniques here. And one of the ways we did that was actually recreating in much smaller form, step-by-step Cassatt's process here. And I think Jan and Faya are going to link to the video that we made for visitors to really understand Cassatt's incredible process here, step-by-step.
The next few galleries of the Mary Cassatt at Work exhibition are organized thematically. We wanted to take certain subjects that Cassatt returns to again and again over her 50-year career and to explore the ways in which she sort of tackles those subjects and the ways in which, in fact, they might become sort of her equivalent of Mont Salvatoire or her Japanese footbridge and water lily pond, that she is equally, like all of her sort of male impressionist peers, takes up subjects again and again, finding extraordinary pictorial appeal in them. This is a gallery devoted to handwork. There's a quote on the wall from Cassatt that says, "Oh, how wild I am to get to work, my fingers fairly itch." And that comes to life in a painting such as this one, Lydia at her tapestry frame. Her sister, Lydia, elder sister Lydia, is the model for this work. And her sister is engaged in handwork, in embroidery. What we see in this subject is, in this painting, is Cassatt really taking the subject seriously, taking the idea of women occupying themselves, showing off their skill in handwork, and Cassatt brings that to the level of a large oil painting with the sort of most modern impressionist techniques. I'm struck by how much she zooms in on this scene. We see very little of the background. Instead, the tapestry frame, her sister's pink dress, and her upholstered chair sort of seem to fill the canvas with also a very lively sense of Cassatt's color and brushwork. We don't see what her sister is working on. In fact, we see the underside of the frame and her sister's hand. So the hand is in motion, it's somewhat blurred. Cassatt is seemingly almost sort of creating a kind of a play between her own creative work with color and pattern and her sister's work. This is kind of occupation, the handwork that women would do at the time, sometimes as paid occupation, other times as kind of leisure activity that is not often taken very seriously. And I think Cassatt's attentiveness to it, again, is a way in which she is mining the subjects around her for subject matter that she can then sort of bring into a kind of modernist sphere through the way that she's working with her pastel stick, her paintbrush, or even her etching needle.
And I think what's especially interesting is while Cassatt can really is clearly so interested in the subject, in really trying to capture the intense concentration of her subjects and her sister, she's still really intent on distinguishing what she's doing as an artist from this kind of activity that she's depicting. And so, as Jenny was mentioning earlier, she is so intent and committed to an identity as a professional artist. That's so clear in her letters. It's also clear in the way that her family is kind of talking about what she's doing. And so the kind of, I don't know if it's a tension or a kind of something to note, that while she's, I think, really fixated on, as Jenny was saying, elevating this kind of subject in her works, she has a kind of an identity as a professional working artist that she's really committed to, and really insistent on to everyone around her.
And that maybe comes to the fore in this work. We're now in a gallery devoted to childcare. It's, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's what is often associated with Cassatt. And in this gallery, we get a great sense of the variety of childcare. So there are games of patty cake. There are scenes of breastfeeding. There are, again, scenes of bathing. And there's this scene from the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection titled Maternal Caress. We know that that was the early title for it. We've wrestled with it a little bit because we're not entirely certain that there's a caress happening here, and who is doing the caressing? Is it the woman or is it the child? Much like the first painting we looked at, we do see the child's face sort of take center stage here. The woman is, again, slightly obscured, but of course her hand, which is gripping the child's arm and keeping the child's fingers, I guess, from deeply probing into her face, is there as a sort of firm but calm presence. This is a painting that we know Cassatt worked on in the summer of 1896. She wrote to her art dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, about it. She writes, "I was extremely persistent with this, perhaps too much, but I only finished it on Saturday, and I'm counting on it improving as it settles." Despite our study over the last several years of this work, our intense sort of looking at it in the conservation studio, we aren't quite sure what she meant by persistence. Maybe it was about the way that she applied the color, her attention to the sort of floral patterning on the woman's very sort of large sleeve. We do know, however, that Cassatt may have been a little impatient to finish this work and to get it off to her dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, because we discovered that some of the green paint from the very edge of the canvas had transferred onto the frame, and it still survives on the inside of this frame. So it tells us a couple of things. This is, in fact, the original frame on this painting. Just as Cassatt sent the painting off while it was still wet, her impatience to see it on the art market was perhaps shared by Durand-Ruel because he framed it when it was still wet. And this is a kind of reminder that part of being a professional artist is selling your work. It's finding a market, working with a dealer. In this case, Cassatt worked, like all of the other Impressionists, with Paul Durand-Ruel, who was the major dealer who took the first kind of risk and invested in the Impressionists. She would, in fact, through Durand-Ruel, sell this painting to a New York collector. So it would come to the US in pretty quick order. And Cassatt was particularly attuned to the market. It was obviously critical to establishing her reputation, her recognition as an artist, which was part of that professionalism that Laurel mentioned.
I'll just stop us on this pastel here, which is another work that was exhibited in the 1881 Impressionist exhibition. And you might be familiar with the painting that we started with. We see the same wallpaper, this kind of a flame flurry of pastel strokes here. And in fact, this pastel, I think, allows us to emphasize the point that actually, despite some of the titles or assumptions we bring to works like this, these are in fact unrelated, probably paid models. In this case, we know, especially from the woman's garment, that this is most likely a nanny or a paid caregiver. And so we just are trying to kind of peel back some of the assumptions and emphasize that these are scenes that Cassatt really constructed and was interested in exploring the kind of intense psychological and physical work of this kind of care, this kind of entanglement. And it's a kind of, she finds endless inspiration from it across her materials and across decades. And this is a really charming example, I think, of that.
I think one of the interesting sort of facts or things we need to consider with Cassatt and this fascination that she has with the subject of childcare is that she doesn't marry or have children herself. She was really committed to her career. It was a moment in which women really couldn't do both. You couldn't have a family and get married and continue an artistic career. So it's particularly striking that she decides to devote so much of her artistic energy to the subjects of women and children. It's often thought that she was restricted in her subject matter, and that because she couldn't be out and about in the streets in Paris without a chaperone, it wouldn't have been acceptable for a woman of her social class. So that it's seen that maybe she was forced into this domestic sphere, and this had to become her subject matter. I think we would feel pretty strongly, having spent so much time, thinking and looking at her works. This is very much her choice, is that she recognized that she understood the world of maybe the domestic interior, the world of women, what it meant to attend the theater, to dress, to go out, to be at home reading the newspaper or reading various books. That this for her became a very rich subject. It was a subject that few of her peers were tackling at the moment. Maury So might be one that was thinking of it at the time, but I think it's more an example of opportunity that she had, rather than necessarily feeling like she was so constricted that all she could do was.
And in so doing, she really makes the work and attention of childcare or of being a woman in the world really meaningfully visible, I think, for one of the first times.
We're walking through a section of the gallery which explores women in private. It's opposite a section of women in public. And again, it helps, I think, to suggest some of that dichotomy as women navigated through these different spaces. This is a wall of women at home, women and girls, who are reading. And I think that's a wonderful way of also considering that even when you're at home reading, be it literature or be it the newspaper, you are in fact engaging with ideas from the broader world and engaging in an intellectual activity which brings you into contact with many others. We're stopped in front of a remarkable pair of paintings that we've been able to bring together for the exhibition. They're two oil paintings done in 1909 of a model named Françoise, who's a young girl who must have been a very good model, because Cassatt uses her as her subject on about 30 occasions. And we see two different versions of the subject of Françoise reading. One time it is what appears to be a sketch. It is a very loosely worked painting. We see large areas of a light-colored canvas on view. We see Cassatt, no signs here of her working with pencil or sketching this out. In fact, you get a really kind of visceral, very lively sense that she's loaded up her brush with color, and as she's just sort of launching herself into sort of mapping out this composition with her model in front of her. The painting on the right is a different take on the same subject. And one of the questions I get asked often is this the finished version of the painting on the left? And I think they might just be two different attempts at the same subject. And I don't think one is perhaps necessarily better than the other. It's just Cassatt coming back to the subject maybe on 2 different days or 2 different weeks. We do see in the right a much more fully finished canvas. It's what we expect. Every inch of it is covered with color. She's given us an extraordinary amount of detail to the background, to the setting, to the girl's dress, to the book that she has in her hand. And what's interesting is there's such a different reading that we can find between these two works. And one, she seems to be intently reading, and in the other, her eyes seem to drift off, and you can almost imagine her wanting to go play in the garden. And I think that is, a point I made a little earlier, is that this sense of repetition in Cassatt's work is about solving different pictorial problems. It's about, pursuing different maybe pictorial paths, which is something that, many artists and many of the Impressionists are doing at this moment.
So just as Cassatt is really intent on capturing the intense activity, the engagement of her subjects, in the final gallery of the exhibition, we've gathered paintings and prints that show figures similarly really engaged, but largely deep in thought, maybe in moments of contemplation or meditation. And I'm going to just point out this remarkable print. It's a dry point, which is a really difficult printmaking medium that involves scratching directly into metal with a really sharp tool. And here Cassatt is depicting a woman. And in Cassatt's body of work, we only know of 2 instances of self-portraiture, but there's a really new piece of scholarship by Nicole Georgopoulos that really convincingly argues that this might be a 3rd instance of a self-portrait in Cassatt's oeuvre. And there's a number of reasons, including this we know to be one of Cassatt's favorite hats that she was known to wear. In earlier versions of this print, she actually hid her dog, her beloved dog, among her skirts. And really interestingly, the print is titled Reflection, and there might be a couple of ways to think about this. You may have grasped so far that many of the figures in Cassatt's works are often looking elsewhere, either looking through opera glasses or in conversation with another person, or looking outward. In this case, this figure is looking directly out as if to meet the viewer's gaze. And that's very unusual in Cassatt's body of work. And one of the reasons might be is that Cassatt herself was looking in a mirror while she was making this scene. And in that case, the blurriness of her hands here would describe the fact that she's, at active work on her printmaking plate. And so we're really struck by this kind of self-presentation. It's left a little bit ambiguous. The title is Reflection, but I think she's, here inviting us to consider, this kind of engaged woman who's deep and connected kind of thought.
So one of the things that we've found in this exhibition is that Cassatt often alludes us. There's a quote very early on in the show that for me often encapsulates Cassatt, and it is, what one would like to leave behind one is superior art and a hidden personality. And so one of the challenges we've had in sort of learning more about Cassatt's approach to her artistic practice, to even some of the how she structured her days as an artist, has continued to kind of elude us. And I think that self-portrait, is it a self-portrait or not? I think I'm convinced it is, but it's not an obvious self-portrait. And that actually applies a little bit perhaps with this painting, a very well-known work, which is a tremendous sort of conclusion to the exhibition. And here I'll just point to the dog. This is one of Cassatt's Brussels Griffons. She raised many of them. She has a succession of these dogs. This one is thought to be called Batty. And I often see this as Batty's presence sleeping on the chair here is a little bit of Cassatt standing in this painting, in which we do have, in fact, 2 sort of sleepy models. And of course, the central subject here is a young girl in an unguarded, relaxed moment in which she has, is showing her sort of just exhaustion. She's fed up with sitting upright, keeping her skirt over her knees. And again, that sense of Cassatt understanding children and bringing that what is be a very personal, very moment, and making that the subject of her canvas. This, of course, is also a fairly complex painting in terms of its history. Recent research at the National Gallery of Art in Washington has again convincingly shown us that Edgar Degas, Cassatt's close friend in this period in the late 1870s, may have suggested to her just the back of the room, in particular the corner that comes together near the window with these 2 well-stuffed or well-upholstered chairs. And so Degas may have helped her with maybe, or made a few suggestions with the arrangement of the room, suggestions that she seems to have embraced and taken on in the spirit of, continually experimenting and reworking her canvases. But the girl, I think we can be certain, is all Cassatt. And that again is that sense of Cassatt interested in capturing maybe a fleeting, unguarded moment in time, using, her understanding of young children or of what it was like to be, a girl who was growing up constantly being told how to behave. And then to make that the subject of one of the larger canvases that she embarks on, I think is again a sign of her commitment to these subjects, which were being overlooked in many other areas. And so it's, I think, a nice way to think about how Cassatt will explore these, seemingly unimportant everyday subjects, and to use them as a place in which she can bring, her sense of color, her very vibrant handwork. I mean, so when you're here in the gallery, you're very much aware of individual brushstrokes of, orange paint and turquoise paint, and how they're almost kind of slashing. There's a really active quality, I think, that comes from looking at this canvas in person.
We hope we can welcome you here in person. There's 125 works by Cassatt in this exhibition, prints, pastels, and paintings. And I think with that, we're very happy to receive any questions. Great.
Yes, we have questions, and most people put them in the Q&A, but we have some in the chat as well, and lots of compliments. So I'm first going to turn to, for those people maybe who tuned in late or other people want to see this, we will find that if you go to the French Embassy's YouTube channel, so you type that in, you will see the museum series, and this is number 18 in the series. It will be uploaded in the upcoming days, and anybody who registered, the link will be sent to the registered members, all of you. So that's number one that we wanted to say. And we want to point back again to the wonderful website for Mary Cassatt at Work, the Philadelphia site, because it includes a couple of things, one of them being an hour-long audio guide. And what knowing about it and having seen the exhibition, I was really moved to be able to hear Mary Cassatt's own words. So it comes up highly recommended, to say the least. And so that is, and then the other thing is that you can find Mary Cassatt's printmaking technique is on a YouTube video. So you can go further in getting closer to Mary Cassatt at Work. I would like to mention a couple of questions or comments. One of them was that several people have noted that the woodblock prints have opened up so much to people, that many people were only aware of her paintings of domestic scenes, and then we have this new technique and her passion for them. Someone did ask, because she was so interested, why aren't they in the exhibit? And the answer is, if we had everything that Mary Cassatt was interested in, the show, I think, would go a little bit. But looking in the catalog, there are references to all of these things. Compliments too to Mary Cassatt is someone was dazzled by the wallpaper effect, and thank you so much to pointing this out. Many of the questions that we had right at the beginning, which are in the Q&A, had to do with Mary Cassatt's position as a woman in France, as a painter in Paris and in the United States. So I just wanted, perhaps you can address that. Is the question is, where was she born? How much time did she spend in the United States? How long was she in Paris? So if you could give us that, and maybe I guess we might go to another painting to answer that, or you're going to stay in the same room to answer this question about where was she, who were her friends. And you did mention Degas, and you mentioned the 1881 Impressionist exhibition. So we did have a question too, Mary Cassatt and Impressionists and Impressionism. I've turned the stage, I'm turning it back over to you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, there's much to be told about Cassatt, her life and her biography, and of course it is woven to a certain degree in the exhibition, but we do get obviously very invested in telling, our investigation of her actual working process. I think maybe we will move in this gallery because Cassatt's family is heavily featured in this last gallery, and that might be an opportunity to think about her family and this extraordinary transatlantic life that she lives. Cassatt was born in Allegheny City, Pittsburgh in 1844. It was then a suburb of Pittsburgh. It is now part of the city of Pittsburgh. She's spent very little time in Pittsburgh, though. Family kept moving further east towards the Philadelphia area. And then she spent about 5 years of her childhood between the ages of 6 and 11 living in Europe. They were partly in Europe so that her older brother, Alexander Cassatt, could study engineering there. So they were there to really further his education, but the education of all the children. Cassatt, then the family comes back when she's around 11 to the Philadelphia area. And she spends maybe the next perhaps the next 7 or 8 years in this region. She lives in Philadelphia for a very small portion of her life, even though we like to call her or think of her as being a Philadelphian. But from her age 25, after she studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, she goes to Europe and comes back very infrequently. So she spends 54 years of her 78-year life living in France. And in so many respects, her career unfolds in a European context. She never loses her American ties. She apparently spoke with an American accent, even in French, throughout her life. She remains close to her American family. So her brother, Alexander, her brother, Gardner, both live here in Philadelphia. So she's very much aware of what's happening in Philadelphia. She stays perhaps on top of the gossip. But from 1874 onwards, she's settled in Paris, and her parents join her 3 years later. So that her parents spend the last 15 years of their lives living with her in France. So she occupies this really interesting position of an American artist who is fully integrated into the French art world, and becomes an integral member of the Impressionists. And the Impressionists are a group that is one of the first artistic groups that is composed of men and women who are really equal partners and contributors to the movement. So, Morisot is one of the founders of the Impressionists, participates in the first show in 1874. Cassatt will join the artist 5 years later in 1879, but then becomes just a perfectly accepted member of the Impressionists and is very much part of that art world. So it's kind of challenging to, is she American, is she French? She really straddles both these worlds. And I think that's also had something to do with her reputation and the legacy in the years since then. Because her works are managed by American art curators, they're managed by European curators. But just as she bridges the world of paintings and pastels and prints, and so she's this wonderfully adept and fluid and versatile artist. Yeah. And I hope that our exhibition has done a little bit to bring that back into the conversation.
Just
Thank
to
you.
add one more point sort of about her family, about her position, about her class. There's a letter in the PMA archives here from her father to her brother in 1878 that was really informative for us in thinking about Cassatt's professionalism. In 1878, her father writes about this arrangement that he has with his daughter and describes it like if Mary is going to pursue an artistic career, I've told her that her studio has to pay for itself. And so we know this is in 1878, just on the eve of her sort of joining up with the Impressionist cause, that she really, in order to become an artist, it really has to become a pursuit that is all-encompassing and self-sustaining. And so she really throws her lot in with the Impressionists, and that really becomes central to her identity, this kind of professionalism. She continues to be supported and lives with her family. She comes from immense privilege, but her artistic practice is her own, and it has to grow on her own accord, and it has to support itself. And I think having a sense of that has really helped us understand the seriousness of her career and better understand her own identity and how it related to her family.
Thank you so much. We have time we have a lot of comments and questions. One of them is quite specific that I will ask, and that is back to the reflections. We don't have to go back to that, to the dry point. The area around her eyes is strikingly white, almost mask-like. Any comments that you have about that?
Yeah, I've been getting that. That's a comment that's come up before. I mean, as I mentioned, Cassatt really, I think, was drawn especially to printmaking for its ability to be worked and reworked. You can make changes to a printmaking plate. It's not effortless. It's quite hard to do, but there's a real capacity to kind of continue to eke out new effects with the same plate. And so in that case, I think it's a question of kind of working a little bit, reworking, maybe even burnishing or kind of wiping ink away from that area. It sort of looks a little bit whiter here in relation to the kind of darkness of the dry point everywhere else. I don't have a kind of resolved answer about that, but it's something that I and many other visitors have remarked on.
Good, people are looking closely. That we have a number of questions which have to do with her place, her friendship with Degas, but the larger question is, how is Cassatt as a woman and a woman artist defined through the lens of Paris in the 19th century? That's a background question, but we also have a very specific question about how her reputation has changed or not changed, as the case may be. Have the curators noted any shift in how Cassatt is perceived or ranked by academia and the public over the last 40 years, since the time of people like Mary Cassatt and others started to look more carefully at women in art? So we have about 5 minutes or so for an answer. We have lots of other questions, but that is really one that we have been asked today in many different ways. So if you could respond to that, would be wonderful.
Sure. 5 minutes. That's a tough challenge because it is, I mentioned a little bit that, Cassatt she both falls between the cracks, but then she belongs in all of these different worlds. And what we see so often in her paintings is the world of Paris and late 19th century. So we do see a French world, but very much through Cassatt's own particular lens. Of course, her friendships with Degas and the other Impressionists are ones that were formulated very early on, as soon as she met them in the mid 1870s, and then really become lifelong friendships. So she's visiting Renoir during World War I. She's living very nearby him. So these are, of course, lifelong friendships that are hard to always bring out, perhaps in the framework of an exhibition like this. But in terms of thinking about, Cassatt and changing conversations and ideas about her, of course, scholarship is always ongoing. I think we've found in the last maybe decade or so, there have been a great number of articles that have come out, often being a deep dive into a single work. So thinking about Nicole Georgopoulos' article on reflection, there have been a number of other articles that have begun to bring out a greater complexity to her subject matter, and that there's often much more running below the surface than she's been given credit for. She does, as an American, though, sometimes fall out of the conversations about Impressionism. And so, we're very mindful that there often are many American museums that host Cassatt exhibitions, and there still are, I think, a number of European exhibitions that probably should be organized to bring Cassatt to a greater attention and awareness. That she was really an equal and a partner and a friend of Degas and Renoir and Morisot and Pissarro. And I think I'm not sure if you necessarily asked someone in Paris if they would necessarily have that name recognition for Cassatt that she does in an American context. So obviously we're interested in putting her back into the conversation and putting her in the conversation very much in the sense, not as an American, but as an artist active in Paris and active with these various Impressionists techniques and materials.
Yeah, and right, obviously her, maybe not obviously, but her Cassatt's works were hugely important for feminist art history. They continue to be. And yet I think there's a way that in some ways her subject matter, which maybe has been understood as kind of feminine or acceptably kind of feminine, it has in some ways obscured some of the ways that we can look more closely at her actual methods. What is she actually depicting and how is she doing it? So with our show, I think we were especially interested because there hadn't really been a full kind of wide investigation of her working methods and tools and materials, at really kind of thinking both about subject matter and the kind of materials that are allowing her to do what she's doing. There's so much more to do. And I think another maybe point to end on is just Cassatt's own role in kind of thinking about her reputation and legacy. This exhibition, as we've said, includes 125 works, and they're all from US collections or private collections, institutions and private collections, because Cassatt herself was so kind of adept and persistent at placing her works in US institutions and really cared about her kind of lasting mark here. I don't know if you want to say anything more there.
And I mean, there are other stories which we weave into the end of the exhibition, and that Cassatt was not just interested in her own reputation and legacy and making sure that her works were collected by Europeans as well as Americans, but one of the great efforts that she makes in maybe the second half of her life and her career is encouraging American collectors to buy Impressionism, and with the understanding that they will present those works to American museums. And so in many, many respects, I think we owe a great deal to Cassatt for the number of Impressionist works that are housed in American museums, because she really kind of started an American taste for Impressionism and encouraged her brother to acquire Impressionist works. She didn't quite convince him to give them to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So we're delighted to have this picture, although we did acquire it from an auction. But Cassatt also plays a really interesting role in the formation of American private and public collections of Impressionist works, as well as Old Master paintings as well. So she's again a hard artist to kind of, she doesn't kind of sit neatly in all these baskets. She's very, very active on so many fronts. And I think that's what makes her perhaps hard to grapple with, but also such an interesting artist at the same time.
And well, we want to thank you very much for
Thank you so
this.
much. Yeah.
The hour went by so quickly, and we're want to thank you. And I think in talking about the position of the artist of Mary Cassatt, this exhibition is a step toward it's because it is so unusual and having new research, so much of it on the prints and drawings and paintings, that it's going to take us all a step forward understanding Mary Cassatt. Well, we've now come to the end of our program, I'm sorry to say, but I want to make once again for those of you not able to visit, please see the website for various things that will take you closer. The catalog, of course, is wonderful with more information. And then on the French Embassy YouTube site, this program that you heard today will be up in a few days after it's uploaded. And I would also like to say again, the show closes September the 8th. The museum is open Thursday through Monday, and the advantage is that on Friday nights, it's Friday night late. So thank you very much, and thank you, Jenny and Laurel, and the team that you who are watching this can't see, with our crew behind the scenes, the director, and everybody at the French Embassy. So thank you very much.